There is a law written into the deepest structure of matter that no experiment has ever violated, no theory has ever overturned, and no force in the universe has ever broken. It is not a law about what particles can do. It is a law about what particles cannot do, and what they cannot do is be alone. The law is called quark confinement. It governs the behavior of the most fundamental building blocks of matter, the quarks, the elementary particles from which protons, neutrons, and all other hadrons are composed. And it states, with absolute, exceptionless finality, that no quark can ever exist in isolation. No quark has ever been observed alone. No experiment has ever produced a solitary quark. And the reason is not that our instruments are too weak or our accelerators too small. The reason is that the universe itself forbids it. The laws of physics are structured, at the most fundamental level, to make isolation impossible. This is not a metaphor. It is not a poetic interpretation of an abstract physical principle. It is the literal, experimentally confirmed, mathematically precise truth about the deepest layer of physical reality. The universe will not permit a quark to be alone, and the mechanism by which it enforces this prohibition is one of the most extraordinary and most revealing features of the natural world. To understand quark confinement, we must begin with the strong force, the force that binds quarks together inside protons and neutrons, and that holds the nucleus of every atom in the universe together against the electromagnetic repulsion that would otherwise tear it apart. The strong force is the most powerful force in nature. It is approximately 100 times stronger than electromagnetism, 1,000,000 times stronger than the weak nuclear force, and 10 to the 38th times stronger than gravity. It operates at extremely short range. Its effects are significant only at distances smaller than the size of an atomic nucleus, approximately 1 femtometer, 1 quadrillionth of a meter. Beyond this range, the strong force is effectively invisible. You do not feel it. Your instruments do not detect it in everyday conditions. It operates entirely within the nucleus, binding quarks into protons and neutrons and binding protons and neutrons into nuclei, providing the structural integrity that makes matter stable, atoms possible, chemistry viable, and your existence achievable. The history of the strong force is a history of uncovering layers of structure within what was previously thought to be elementary. In the 1960s, Murray Gell-Mann and George Zweig independently proposed that the protons and neutrons that constitute the atomic nucleus are not elementary particles. They are composite made of smaller, more fundamental particles that Gell-Mann called quarks and that Zweig called aces. The proposal was initially met with skepticism, because no one had ever observed a free quark. The quarks were hidden inside the protons and neutrons, invisible to every detector, inaccessible to every experiment. Many physicists regarded them as mathematical fictions, useful bookkeeping devices for organizing the zoo of hadrons that particle accelerators were discovering, but not real physical entities. The reality of quarks was established by the deep inelastic scattering experiments at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center in the late 1960s and early 1970s. By firing high-energy electrons at protons and analyzing the scattering patterns, Jerome Friedman, Henry Kendall, and Richard Taylor demonstrated that the proton has internal structure, that it contains point-like objects that the electrons bounce off of, exactly as Gell-Mann and Zweig had predicted. The experiments earned Friedman, Kendall, and Taylor the 1990 Nobel Prize in Physics and established quarks as real, physical, experimentally confirmed constituents of matter. But the same experiments that confirmed the existence of quarks also confirmed the impossibility of observing them in isolation. The quarks were inside the proton. They could be detected through their scattering patterns, but they could not be extracted. No matter how much energy the experimenters poured into the collision, The quarks remained confined within hadrons. The prison was real, and the warden was the strong force. 6 types of quarks have been discovered: up, down, strange, charm, bottom, and top. The up and down quarks are by far the lightest, and the most common. They are the quarks that constitute the protons and neutrons in every atom in your body. The heavier quarks, strange, charm, bottom, and top, are produced in high-energy collisions and decay rapidly into up and down quarks. The top quark, discovered at Fermilab in 1995, is the heaviest elementary particle ever observed, with a mass approximately 170 times greater than the proton. But even the top quark, massive as it is, cannot exist alone. It decays in approximately 5 times 10 to the minus 25 seconds before the strong force even has time to form a hadron around it. The top quark is the closest thing in nature to a free quark, and it lasts for less than a trillionth of a second. The strong force is mediated by particles called gluons. The strong force is equivalent of photons, which mediate electromagnetism. But gluons have a property that photons do not. Gluons carry the charge that they transmit. Photons are electrically neutral. They transmit electromagnetic force between charged particles, but they themselves carry no charge. Gluons carry color charge. The strong force is equivalent of electric charge, and because they carry the charge they transmit, they interact with each other. Photons do not interact with photons, but gluons interact with gluons, and this self-interaction is the key to everything that follows. Color charge comes in 3 varieties, whimsically named red, green, and blue, with corresponding anti-colors: anti-red, anti-green, and anti-blue. The names have nothing to do with actual colors. They are labels for a quantum property that has no classical analog, chosen because the mathematics of color charge works like the mathematics of color mixing. Red plus green plus blue equals white color neutral. And the fundamental rule of the strong force is this: only color neutral combinations are permitted to exist as free particles. A single quark, which carries a single color charge, is not color neutral. It cannot exist alone. It must combine with other quarks in a color neutral combination. 3 quarks of different colors, red, green, and blue, forming a baryon such as a proton or a neutron, or a quark and an antiquark of color and anticolor forming a meson. The requirement of color neutrality is enforced with the same absolute finality as the conservation of energy or the conservation of charge. No experiment has ever produced a color-charged free particle. No theoretical model that violates color confinement has ever been consistent with the experimental data. The Clay Mathematics Institute has listed the proof of quark confinement as one of its 7 Millennium Prize problems, one of the 7 most important unsolved problems in mathematics, with a prize of $1 million for a rigorous proof. The proof has not yet been achieved, but the phenomenon itself is not in doubt. Confinement is an experimental fact, confirmed by every measurement of hadron physics, every lattice QCD calculation, and every particle accelerator experiment performed in the past 50 years. The color-charge analogy extends further. Just as the 3 primary colors of light combine to produce white light, colorless, transparent, undifferentiated, the 3 color charges of quarks combine to produce a color-neutral hadron, a particle that, from the outside, shows no trace of the raging chromodynamic storm that constitutes its interior. The proton appears, from the perspective of electromagnetism and gravity, as a simple, structureless, positive point charge. But inside, it is a maelstrom of quarks and gluons, constantly exchanging color, constantly creating and annihilating virtual quark-antiquark pairs, constantly fluctuating in energy and momentum, a universe of activity concealed beneath a surface of apparent simplicity. The proton is the ultimate lesson in the distinction between surface and depth. On the surface, simplicity, and independence. In the depth, complexity, and inseparable relationship, the universe does not merely prefer color-neutral states, it demands them. And the mechanism by which it enforces this demand is quark confinement, a mechanism so relentless, so absolute, and so unlike anything else in physics that it deserves to be understood in detail. Imagine trying to separate two quarks inside a proton. You apply energy, you pull them apart. In every other force in nature, this would work. Pull two magnets apart, and the magnetic force between them decreases with distance. Pull two charged particles apart, and the electromagnetic force between them decreases with the square of the distance. Pull two masses apart, and the gravitational force between them decreases with the square of the distance. Every force you have ever encountered gets weaker with distance. The farther apart the objects, the weaker the force. The strong force does the opposite. As you pull two quarks apart, the strong force between them does not decrease, it increases. The farther apart the quarks, the stronger the force that pulls them back together. The gluon field between the quarks does not spread out and weaken like an electromagnetic field. It concentrates into a narrow tube, a flux tube, a string of gluon field energy that stretches between the quarks like an elastic band. And the energy stored in the flux tube increases linearly with the distance between the quarks. Pull the quarks 1 femtometer apart, and the flux tube contains a certain amount of energy. Pull them 2 femtometers apart, and it contains twice as much. Pull them 3 femtometers apart, and it contains 3 times as much. The energy in the flux tube increases without limit as the quarks are separated. And here is where the confinement mechanism reveals its full genius. When the energy in the flux tube becomes large enough, approximately 1 GeV, the energy equivalent of 1 proton mass, the tube snaps. But it does not snap like a broken string, leaving 2 free ends. It snaps by creating a new quark-antiquark pair from the energy stored in the tube. The energy of the stretching is converted, through Einstein's E equals mc squared, into the mass of 2 new quarks. Where there were 2 quarks connected by a tube, there are now 4 quarks, 2 pairs, each confined in its own hadron. You started with 1 proton, you ended with 1 proton and 1 meson. You never produced a free quark. The universe converted the energy you invested in trying to isolate a quark into the creation of new quarks, ensuring that isolation was never achieved. The process is called Hadronization, and it has been observed directly in particle accelerator experiments. At the Large Hadron Collider, when quarks are produced in high-energy proton-proton collisions, they do not emerge as free particles. They emerge as jets, narrow sprays of hadrons that form as the separating quarks generate flux tubes that snap repeatedly, creating cascades of new quark-antiquark pairs that immediately bind into mesons and baryons. The jets are the visible signature of confinement in action, the universe, creating companions for every quark that threatens to be alone at the speed of light, with the inexorable efficiency of a law that has never been broken. The energy required to separate quarks has been measured with precision. The string tension of the flux tube, the energy per unit length, is approximately 0.9 GeV per femtometer, or equivalently, about 14 metric tons. This means that pulling 2 quarks, 1 femtometer apart, requires a force equivalent to the weight of 14 metric tons. This is the force required to separate 2 objects that are each smaller than a trillionth of a meter. The strong force is not called strong by accident. It is the most powerful force in nature, and it deploys this power for a single purpose: to prevent isolation. This is not a practical limitation. It is not that we lack the energy or the technology to isolate a quark. It is that the laws of physics are structured so that the attempt to isolate a quark automatically generates the companions that prevent the isolation. The more energy you invest in the attempt, the more companions the universe creates. The prohibition is absolute, self-enforcing, and built into the mathematical structure of quantum chromodynamics, the theory of the strong force that has been confirmed by every experiment performed in the past 5 decades. The 2004 Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded to David Gross, H. David Politzer, and Frank Wilczek for the discovery of asymptotic freedom, the counterintuitive property of the strong force that makes confinement possible. Asymptotic freedom means that the strong force becomes weaker at short distances and stronger at long distances. When quarks are close together within the tiny volume of a proton, the strong force is relatively weak, and the quarks behave almost as free particles. They can move, interact, and rearrange themselves with relative freedom. But as soon as they try to separate, the force strengthens, the flux tube forms, and the confinement mechanism activates. Asymptotic freedom was described by Wilczek as the most counterintuitive property in all of physics. Every other force weakens with distance and strengthens with proximity. The strong force does the reverse. The discovery of asymptotic freedom was so unexpected, so contrary to every intuition that physicists had developed from their experience with electromagnetism and gravity, that it initially seemed impossible. Gross, Politzer, and Wilczek had to perform the calculation 3 times before they believed the result. The mathematics was unambiguous. The strong coupling constant, the measure of the force's strength, decreases at short distances and increases at long distances. The force that binds quarks is the only force in nature that becomes stronger as the bound objects try to separate. This means that the interior of a proton is a realm of relative freedom. The quarks inside the proton are not pinned in place. They are not frozen in fixed positions. They are in constant motion, exchanging gluons, changing colors, fluctuating in energy, behaving almost as if they were free particles, constrained only by the requirement that they remain within the proton's boundary. The boundary is not a wall. It is a gradient, a smooth increase in the force that becomes significant only when a quark tries to leave. Inside the proton, the quarks are free. At the boundary, the prison walls appear, and beyond the boundary, the force becomes infinite. No quark has ever escaped. The metaphor is almost too perfect. Freedom is found in closeness, and imprisonment is found in distance. The quarks are free when they are together, and confined when they try to be apart. Proximity liberates. Separation confines. The physics of the most fundamental particles in the universe encodes, at the deepest level, a principle that is the exact opposite of the human intuition about freedom and confinement. We think freedom means being apart, independent, autonomous, unattached. The quarks know otherwise. For them, freedom is found only in relationship. Isolation is the prison. The QCD vacuum, the ground state of the strong force field, is not empty. It is a seething, dynamic, energy-dense medium filled with virtual gluons and virtual quark-antiquark pairs that pop into and out of existence continuously. The vacuum is not a void. It is a plenum, a fullness of potential that pervades every point of space and that provides the medium through which the strong force operates. Even in the absence of any real quarks, the vacuum is alive with the fluctuations of the gluon field, a sea of virtual particles that constitutes the ground state of the strong interaction. The energy density of the QCD vacuum is enormous. The virtual gluon field contributes approximately 1 GeV per cubic femtometer to the energy density of the vacuum, a staggering amount by any standard. This vacuum energy is what gives the proton most of its mass. The quarks inside a proton, 2 up quarks and 1 down quark, account for only about 1% of the proton's mass. The remaining 99% comes from the energy of the gluon field and the kinetic energy of the quark's motion within the proton. You are not made of quarks in any meaningful sense. You are made of the gluon field, made of the energy of the strong force, made of the binding energy that holds the quarks together. You are made of relationship. The mass of your body is, almost entirely, the mass of the connections between quarks, not the mass of the quarks themselves. This is a fact of extraordinary significance. The mass that you feel when you step on a scale, the mass that gravity acts upon, the mass that gives you substance and solidity and physical presence in the world, 99% of this mass is not the mass of anything. It is the mass of the connections between things. The gluon field that binds quarks together is what gives matter its mass. Remove the connections, and the mass disappears. Remove the relationships, and the substance vanishes. You are, at the most fundamental level, made of binding, made of attraction, made of the force that refuses to let the fundamental particles of matter be alone. This fact that 99% of the mass of visible matter is binding energy, not intrinsic particle mass, has a philosophical implication that is rarely appreciated. The materialist worldview assumes that the world is made of stuff, of substance, of matter, of things that have mass and occupy space. But the physics says otherwise. The mass of the world is not the mass of stuff, it is the mass of connections. The proton is heavy not because its quarks are heavy, but because the gluon field that connects them is energetic. The atom is heavy not because its constituents are heavy, but because the binding energy that holds them together contributes to the total mass. The material world is not made of material, it is made of relationship. The philosopher Alfred North Whitehead anticipated this discovery in his process philosophy, arguing that the fundamental constituents of reality are not substances but processes, not things but events, not entities but relationships. Whitehead wrote, "The misconception which has haunted philosophic literature throughout the centuries is the notion of independent existence. There is no such mode of existence." Quark confinement is the experimental confirmation of Whitehead's philosophical insight. Independent existence is not merely unlikely. It is physically impossible. The universe is structured, at its deepest level, to prevent it. The lattice QCD calculations, numerical simulations of the strong force performed on the world's most powerful supercomputers, have confirmed the confinement mechanism with extraordinary precision. The flux tube between quarks has been directly computed. Its energy profile, its thickness, its breaking point, and the masses of the hadrons it produces when it snaps have all been calculated from first principles and found to agree with experimental measurements to within a few percent. Confinement is not a hypothesis. It is a computed, confirmed, quantitatively precise feature of the strong force that emerges naturally from the equations of QCD. And confinement is not unique to quarks. The principle that the fundamental constituents of matter cannot exist in isolation extends to every level of the strong force. Gluons, like quarks, carry color charge and are therefore subject to confinement. You cannot observe a free gluon any more than you can observe a free quark. The strong force confines its own mediator particles, a property that no other force in nature shares. Electromagnetism does not confine photons. Gravity does not confine gravitons. But the strong force confines gluons, ensuring that the mediators of the binding force are themselves bound, that the connectors are themselves connected, that the relationships that constitute matter are themselves constituted by relationships. The contemplative traditions would recognize this immediately. In Buddhism, the concept of pratitya samutpada, dependent origination, states that nothing exists independently. Every phenomenon arises in dependence on other phenomena. Every cause is itself an effect of prior causes. Every entity is constituted by its relationships with other entities. There is no self-existing, independently real, isolation-capable thing anywhere in the universe. The Buddhist claim is not merely philosophical. It is, as the physics of quark confinement demonstrates, a description of the fundamental structure of matter. The quarks do not exist independently. They arise in dependence on the gluon field that binds them. The gluon field does not exist independently. It arises in dependence on the quarks that generate it. The proton does not exist independently. It arises from the mutual dependence of quarks and gluons, each one constituted by its relationship with the others, none of them capable of existing alone. The Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka Karika, the fundamental verses of the Middle Way, provides the most rigorous philosophical analysis of dependent origination. Nagarjuna demonstrates, through a series of devastating logical arguments, that no entity possesses svabhava, inherent, independent, self-sustaining existence. Every entity is empty of independent existence and full of dependent relationships. The quark has no svabhava. The gluon has no svabhava. The proton has no svabhava. Each one is constituted by its relationships with the others, and none can exist independently. Nagarjuna wrote this in the 2nd century CE, 1700 years before the discovery of quarks. But the structure he described, the mutual dependence, the absence of independent existence, the relational constitution of every entity is the exact structure that quantum chromodynamics has confirmed at the most fundamental level of matter. In Christianity, the doctrine of the Trinity describes a God who is, in the divine essence, relational. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are not three independent beings who happen to be associated. They are three persons whose identities are constituted by their relationships with each other. The Father is the Father because of the Son. The Son is the Son because of the Father. The Spirit proceeds from both. Remove any one person, and the others cease to be who they are. The divine nature is not a thing that exists independently and then enters into relationship. The divine nature is the relationship. God is, in the deepest theological sense, the ultimate demonstration of the principle that quark confinement encodes in the structure of matter. Being is relational. Identity is constituted by connection. Isolation is not merely difficult, it is ontologically impossible. The Cappadocian Fathers Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nazianzus, and Gregory of Nyssa developed the doctrine of the Trinity in the 4th century by insisting on a principle that is the exact theological equivalent of quark confinement. The divine persons cannot be separated. You cannot have the Father without the Son. You cannot have the Son without the Spirit. You cannot have the Spirit without the Father. The persons are distinct but inseparable, distinguishable in their properties, but incapable of independent existence. The attempt to isolate a person of the Trinity is as futile as the attempt to isolate a quark. The energy you invest in the separation generates new relationships that prevent the isolation from being achieved. The theological term for the inseparability of the Trinity is perichoresis, the mutual indwelling that we have encountered in previous investigations. Perichoresis describes a state of relationship so intimate that the persons are not merely connected, but constituted by their connections. The Father is who the Father is because of the relationship with the Son. Remove the relationship, and the Father ceases to be the Father. The identity is relational. The being is relational. And the same is true of quarks. A quark is what it is because of its relationship with the gluon field and with other quarks. Remove the relationship, and the quark ceases to exist as a free particle. The quark's identity, like the divine person's identity, is constituted by connection. In Islam, the concept of Tawhid, the absolute oneness of God, has a complementary implication. If God is one, then everything that exists is connected through its common source. Nothing in creation is truly separate from anything else, because everything in creation emanates from the same divine unity. The apparent separateness of objects, beings, and phenomena is a surface appearance that conceals the deeper unity from which they all arise. The quarks are not separate because they cannot be the strong force forbids it. The creation is not separate because it cannot be the divine unity forbids it. In Hinduism, the concept of the Gunas, the three fundamental qualities of nature, sattva, rajas, and tamas, describes a universe in which every phenomenon is a combination of qualities that can never exist in isolation. No phenomenon is purely sattvic, purely rajasic, or purely tamasic. Every phenomenon is a mixture, a color-neutral combination, if you will, of the three fundamental qualities, just as every hadron is a color-neutral combination of the three fundamental color charges. The parallel is structural. In both cases, the fundamental constituents of reality can only exist in specific combinations, never in isolation, and the combinations produce the observable world through their dynamic interplay. In the next stage of this investigation, we will scale this principle upward from the quarks inside the proton to the atoms, molecules, cells, organisms, ecosystems, and galaxies that constitute the larger world. Because the prohibition against isolation that the strong force encodes at the subatomic level is not confined to the subatomic level, it is a fractal principle, a pattern that repeats at every scale of the universe, from the smallest particle to the largest structure, with the same message at every level. Nothing exists alone. Nothing can exist alone. The universe does not permit it, and the loneliness you sometimes feel, the sense that you are separate, isolated, cut off from the world and the people around you may be, in the deepest physical sense, the most profound illusion that decoherence has ever produced. Because at the level of your quarks, at the level of the gluon field that constitutes 99% of your mass, at the level of the fundamental structure of the matter from which you are made, you have never been alone. You cannot be alone. The universe will not allow it. We have established that the most fundamental building blocks of matter quarks are physically incapable of existing in isolation. The strong force forbids it with absolute finality, converting every attempt at separation into the creation of new companions. 99% of the mass of your body is not the mass of particles, but the mass of the gluon field that binds them, the mass of connection, the mass of relationship, the mass of the refusal to be alone. Now we must ask whether this prohibition against isolation is confined to the subatomic world or whether it extends upward through every scale of physical reality, from atoms to molecules to cells to organisms to galaxies. Because if the principle that governs quarks, the principle that being is relational and isolation is forbidden, operates at every scale, then the universe is not merely a collection of objects that happen to interact. It is a system in which interaction is constitutive, in which the objects themselves are created by, sustained by, and defined by their relationships with each other. Let us scale upward, one level at a time. The atom is the first structure above the quark. An atom consists of a nucleus made of protons and neutrons, each of which is made of quarks bound by gluons surrounded by a cloud of electrons. The electrons are bound to the nucleus by the electromagnetic force, the second strongest force in nature, and the way the electrons are bound reveals a principle that is as fundamental and as anti-isolationist as quark confinement. The principle is the Pauli exclusion principle, discovered by Wolfgang Pauli in 1925 and honoured with the Nobel Prize in 1945. The Pauli exclusion principle states that no two fermions, no two particles with half-integer spin, including electrons, protons, and neutrons, can occupy the same quantum state simultaneously. Two electrons in the same atom cannot have the same energy, the same orbital, the same spin, and the same magnetic quantum number. If one electron occupies a quantum state, that state is closed to every other electron in the universe. The Pauli exclusion principle is usually described as a principle of exclusion, a prohibition against two fermions being in the same state. But from the perspective of our investigation, it is something more profound. It is a principle of mandatory differentiation. The exclusion principle does not isolate the electrons. It forces them to be different from each other. It compels each electron to find its own unique quantum state, its own energy level, its own orbital shape, its own spin orientation, and the result of this mandatory differentiation is the periodic table of elements, the structure of every atom, the entire edifice of chemistry, and ultimately, you. Without the Pauli exclusion principle, all electrons would collapse into the lowest energy state of the atom. Every atom would be identical, a tiny, featureless ball of electrons in the ground state. There would be no shells, no orbitals, no chemical properties, no bonds, no molecules, no chemistry, no biology, no life, no consciousness. The exclusion principle forces the electrons outward into higher energy states, creating the layered, structured, chemically active atomic configurations that make the periodic table possible. Carbon has 4 bonding electrons because the exclusion principle forces its electrons into a configuration that exposes 4 electrons to the outside world. Oxygen has 6 because the exclusion principle forces a different configuration. And the difference between carbon and oxygen, the difference that makes organic chemistry possible, that makes DNA possible, that makes you possible, is a consequence of the Pauli exclusion principle's requirement that no 2 electrons can be the same. The exclusion principle is not isolation, it is relational identity. Each electron's identity, its quantum state, its energy, its orbital, its spin is defined in relation to every other electron in the atom. You cannot describe one electron's state without reference to the states of all the other electrons. The electrons are not independent particles that happen to share an atom. They are a single, entangled, quantum mechanical system whose individual identities are constituted by their relationships with each other. Remove one electron, and the quantum states of all the other electrons change. Add one electron, and the entire configuration shifts. The atom is not a collection of independent electrons. It is a web of mandatory relationships that the exclusion principle creates and sustains. The physicist Freeman Dyson calculated that without the Pauli exclusion principle, the atoms in your body would collapse to a size smaller than a single atom. The exclusion principle is the force that gives matter its volume, its structure, and its resistance to compression. When you push against a wall and the wall pushes back, the force you feel is not electromagnetic repulsion in the usual sense. It is the Pauli exclusion principle, the refusal of the electrons in your hand and the electrons in the wall to occupy the same quantum state. The solidity of matter, the hardness, the impenetrability, the structural integrity that makes the physical world navigable is a consequence of the electrons' insistence on being different from each other. This is a remarkable fact. The physical world, the world of solid objects, stable structures, and the reliable surfaces on which you walk, sit, and stand exists because particles are required to be in relationship with each other. The exclusion principle does not create isolation. It creates community, a structured, differentiated, mandatory community of quantum states in which every particle has a unique identity that is defined by its relationship to every other particle. The solidity of your chair, the stability of your bones, the structural integrity of the DNA in your cells, all of these are products of the mandatory relationship constituted isolation prohibiting quantum principle that Wolfgang Pauli discovered a century ago. The chemical bond takes this one step further. Atoms do not exist in isolation any more than quarks do. An atom with unfilled electron shells is chemically reactive. It will seek other atoms with which to share, exchange, or transfer electrons in order to achieve a more stable electronic configuration. The drive toward bonding is not optional. It is a consequence of the energy landscape of electron configurations. Bonded states have lower energy than isolated states, and systems naturally evolve toward lower energy. The atom does not choose to bond. It is driven to bond by the same thermodynamic tendency that drives water downhill and heat from hot to cold. The covalent bond, the bond in which atoms share electrons, is the most intimate form of atomic relationship. In a covalent bond, the shared electrons do not belong to either atom individually. They belong to the bond, to the relationship between the atoms, to the molecular orbital that spans both nuclei and that cannot be attributed to either atom alone. The molecule is not two atoms sitting next to each other. It is a new entity, a quantum mechanical system, whose properties are not reducible to the properties of its component atoms, whose electrons are delocalized across the entire molecular structure, and whose identity is constituted by the bond rather than by the atoms. The carbon atom provides the most vivid illustration. Carbon has 4 electrons available for covalent bonding, making it the most versatile atom in the periodic table, capable of forming single, double, and triple bonds with itself and with a wide range of other elements, producing chains, rings, sheets, and 3-dimensional structures of virtually unlimited complexity. The entire edifice of organic chemistry, the chemistry of life, is built on carbon's capacity for relationship. The carbon atom is the supreme connector. Its identity is constituted by its 4 available bonds, and its potential, the potential that made life possible, is realized only in relationship. A single carbon atom, isolated in a vacuum, is inert. Place it in relationship with other atoms, and it becomes the backbone of every protein, every nucleic acid, every lipid, and every carbohydrate in every living thing on Earth. The potential was always there. The relationship released it. The hydrogen bond, the van der Waals force, the metallic bond, the ionic bond, each is a different form of atomic relationship, and each demonstrates the same principle. Atoms are not self-sufficient entities that can exist in isolation. They are relational entities that are driven by the energy landscape of quantum mechanics toward the formation of bonds that create new, higher-order structures with new, emergent properties. The water molecule has properties that neither hydrogen nor oxygen possesses alone. The DNA molecule has properties that none of its component atoms possess. And the living cell has properties that no molecule, no matter how complex, possesses in isolation. The Higgs field adds another dimension to the prohibition against isolation. Every particle in the universe exists within the Higgs field, a quantum field that pervades all of space and that gives particles their mass through their interaction with it. A particle's mass is not an intrinsic property that it possesses in isolation. It is a relational property that arises from the particle's coupling to the Higgs field. An electron has mass because it interacts with the Higgs field. A photon has no mass because it does not interact with the Higgs field. The mass of every particle in the universe is determined not by what the particle is in itself, but by how it relates to the field that pervades everything. There is no such thing as a particle in isolation from the Higgs field. The field is everywhere. It fills every point of space. It was there before any particle existed, and it will be there after every particle has decayed. Every particle in the universe is, at every moment, in relationship with the Higgs field. And the properties that define the particle, its mass, its inertia, its gravitational behavior, are products of this relationship. The particle is not a thing with properties. It is a relationship with a field that produces properties. Strip away the relationship, and the properties disappear. Quantum field theory extends this insight to every particle and every force in the universe. In quantum field theory, particles are not fundamental objects. They are excitations of quantum fields, localized vibrations in fields that pervade all of space. The electron is an excitation of the electron field. The photon is an excitation of the electromagnetic field. The quark is an excitation of the quark field, and every field pervades every point of space at every moment of time. Whether or not any excitations are present, the fields are always there. They are the ground, the substrate from which every particle emerges and into which every particle eventually dissolves. In this framework, a particle is never alone. It is always embedded in its field. It is always in relationship with the vacuum fluctuations of every other field. And it is always, through the interactions between fields, connected to every other particle in the universe. The electromagnetic field couples to the electron field. The electron field couples to the Higgs field. The Higgs field couples to the quark field. The quark field couples to the gluon field. Every field talks to every other field through the interactions that the Standard Model describes, creating a web of mandatory relationships that spans every point of space and that connects every particle to every other particle through the shared medium of the quantum fields. The physicist Frank Wilczek, one of the discoverers of asymptotic freedom, has described the quantum vacuum as a grid, a dynamic, structured, energy-rich medium that fills all of space and that constitutes the true substance of physical reality. The particles that we observe are not the fundamental entities. The grid is the fundamental entity. The particles are its excitations, temporary, localized disturbances in a medium that is permanent, universal, and connected at every point. You are not made of particles. You are made of the grid, made of the quantum fields that pervade all of space, temporarily excited into the specific pattern of disturbances that constitutes your body, your brain, and your consciousness. The Casimir effect provides direct, experimental evidence that the vacuum itself is relational. In the Casimir effect, two uncharged metal plates placed very close together in a vacuum experience a measurable, attractive force. The force is not electromagnetic, gravitational, or nuclear. It is a vacuum force, a force produced by the quantum fluctuations of the vacuum itself, which are slightly different between the plates and outside the plates due to the boundary conditions that the plates impose. The vacuum between the plates has fewer available quantum modes than the vacuum outside the plates, creating a pressure difference that pushes the plates together. The Casimir effect demonstrates that empty space is not empty. The vacuum is a physical medium with energy, structure, and the capacity to exert force. And the force it exerts is a relational force, a force that arises from the relationship between the plates and the vacuum, a force that does not exist without both the plates and the vacuum in relationship with each other. Even the void is relational. Even nothingness participates in connection. Now scale upward to biology. The cell, the basic unit of life, is the biological equivalent of the atom, a bounded structure that appears from the outside to be a self-contained, independent entity, but that is, in reality, a system of mandatory relationships with its environment. The cell membrane is not a wall. It is a selectively permeable interface, a sophisticated filter that controls the flow of matter, energy, and information between the cell and its environment. The cell cannot exist without this flow. It requires nutrients from the environment. It requires oxygen from the environment. It requires signaling molecules from other cells, and it exports waste products, signaling molecules, and structural components to the environment. The cell is not isolated by its membrane. It is connected through its membrane, connected in a regulated, specific, information-rich manner that the membrane's molecular machinery controls. The cell's communication with its environment is not a minor feature of its biology. It is the central feature. A typical human cell has thousands of different receptor proteins on its surface, each one tuned to a specific molecular signal from the environment: hormones, growth factors, neurotransmitters, cytokines, nutrients, and signals from neighboring cells. The cell is continuously monitoring its environment through these receptors, continuously adjusting its gene expression, its metabolism, and its behavior in response to the information it receives. A cell that is cut off from all signaling, that is placed in a medium devoid of growth factors, hormones, and cell-to-cell contact signals, does not merely become quiescent, it dies. The cell triggers its own death through a process called Anoikis, a form of programmed cell death that is activated when the cell loses contact with its neighbors and its extracellular matrix. The cell would rather die than exist in isolation. The biology has encoded, at the cellular level, the same prohibition that the physics has encoded at the quark level. Isolation is not an option. It is a death sentence. The endosymbiotic theory, developed by Lynn Margulis in the 1960s, reveals that the cell itself is a product of mandatory relationship. The mitochondria that power every eukaryotic cell were, approximately 2 billion years ago, free-living bacteria. They were engulfed by a larger cell in an act of symbiosis that proved so beneficial that neither partner could survive without the other. The mitochondria lost the genes necessary for independent existence. The host cell became dependent on the mitochondria for energy production. And the result was the eukaryotic cell, the cell that constitutes every animal, every plant, every fungus, and every protist on Earth. You are made of cells that are themselves partnerships, ancient, irreversible, constitutive partnerships between organisms that were once independent and that became, through 2 billion years of coevolution, inseparable. The same story repeats with chloroplasts in plant cells, former cyanobacteria that were engulfed and domesticated, providing the photosynthetic capability that makes plant life possible. The eukaryotic cell is not a single organism. It is a community, a consortium of formerly independent organisms that have become so deeply integrated that they can no longer be separated. The cell is a microscopic demonstration of the Quark confinement principle. The components that constitute the cell can no longer exist independently, and the attempt to separate them destroys the cell, just as the attempt to separate quarks destroys the Hadron. At the level of the organism, the prohibition against isolation becomes even more explicit. No multicellular organism is a single entity. It is a community of trillions of cells, each one specialized for a specific function, each one dependent on the others for the resources, the signals, and the structural support that it cannot provide for itself. A neuron cannot survive without the glial cells that nourish it. A muscle cell cannot function without the nerve cells that activate it. A red blood cell cannot navigate the circulatory system without the endothelial cells that line the blood vessels. Every cell in your body is dependent on other cells, and every cell in your body contains the complete genetic blueprint for an entire organism, but it cannot become an organism alone. It can only become an organism in relationship with other cells, in the community of the body, in the mandatory partnership that multicellularity requires. The human body's dependence on internal community extends even to the genome. Approximately 8% of the human genome consists of sequences derived from retroviruses, ancient viruses that infected our ancestors, inserted their DNA into the genome, and became permanent residents of the human genetic code. Some of these viral sequences have been co-opted for essential functions. The syncytin gene, which is essential for the formation of the placenta during pregnancy, is derived from a retroviral envelope gene. Without this viral gift, without the ancient relationship between a virus and a human ancestor, placental pregnancy would not exist, and you would not exist. Your genome is not purely human. It is a community of human sequences and viral sequences, woven together over millions of years of coevolution into an integrated system that neither component could produce alone. The microbiome extends this principle beyond the boundary of the organism. Your body contains approximately 30 trillion human cells and approximately 38 trillion bacterial cells. You are not a single organism. You are an ecosystem, a community of human cells, bacteria, archaea, fungi, and viruses that have co-evolved over millions of years into an integrated system that none of the components can survive without. Your gut bacteria synthesize vitamins that your body cannot produce. Your immune system shapes the composition of your microbiome. Your microbiome shapes the development of your immune system. The relationship is bidirectional, mandatory, and constitutive. Without your microbiome, you would die. Without you, your microbiome would die. You are not a single organism hosting a collection of parasites. You are a Holo-biont, a superorganism constituted by the mandatory relationships between its component species. The depth of the human microbiome relationship is still being discovered, and each discovery deepens the picture of mandatory mutual dependence. The gut-brain axis, the bidirectional communication system between the gut microbiome and the central nervous system, has been shown to influence mood, cognition, stress response, and even social behavior. Germ-free mice raised in sterile environments without any microbiome, show abnormal brain development, impaired social behavior, elevated stress responses, and altered neurotransmitter levels. The microbiome is not merely a digestive aid, it is a constitutive partner in the development and the ongoing function of the nervous system. Your brain, the organ that generates your consciousness, it was shaped in its development and is maintained in its function by organisms that are not you, by the bacterial community that lives in your gut and that communicates with your neurons through chemical signals that cross the gut-brain axis. The philosopher Donna Haraway has described the Holo-biont, the multi-species community that constitutes every organism, as proof that the concept of the individual is a biological fiction. There is no individual organism. There are only communities, communities of cells, communities of species, communities of quantum systems bound by mandatory relationships at every scale. The individual is a surface appearance, like the proton's apparent simplicity. Beneath the surface, there is only community. At the level of the ecosystem, the principle reaches its most familiar expression. No species exists in isolation. Every species is embedded in a web of relationships, predation, competition, mutualism, parasitism, decomposition that connects it to every other species in its ecosystem. Remove a single species, and the entire web is disrupted. Remove a keystone species, and the ecosystem collapses. The ecologist John Muir captured this with his famous observation: when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. The ecologist Robert May demonstrated mathematically that ecosystem stability increases with the complexity of the food web, that ecosystems with more species and more connections between species are more resilient to perturbation than ecosystems with fewer species and fewer connections. The connections are not merely beneficial, they are stabilizing. They are constitutive of the ecosystem's resilience, its adaptability, and its capacity to sustain life. Remove the connections, and the ecosystem does not merely become less efficient, it collapses. The connections are the ecosystem, just as the gluon field is the proton. At the cosmic scale, the prohibition against isolation reaches its grandest expression. The large-scale structure of the universe, the cosmic web that we examined in our investigation of dark matter, is a network of gravitational relationships that connects every galaxy to every other galaxy. The filaments of dark matter that span hundreds of millions of light years are the cosmic equivalent of the gluon flux tubes that connect quarks. They are the binding structures that hold the cosmic community together. that prevent the galaxies from dispersing into isolation, and that create the nodes, the clusters, and the superclusters that constitute the architecture of the observable universe. Even the voids, the vast, apparently empty regions between the filaments, are not truly empty. They contain low-density gas, scattered galaxies, and the cosmic neutrino background, the remnant of the Big Bang that pervades every cubic centimeter of space. There is no place in the universe that is truly void. There is no location that is completely disconnected from every other location. The universe is a plenum, not a vacuum, a fullness of relationship that extends, without interruption, from the quarks inside your protons to the galaxies at the edge of the observable universe. The gravitational binding of the cosmos is the large-scale expression of the same principle that operates at the quark level. Gravity is the weakest force in nature, but it operates at every distance, and it is always attractive. It never repels, it only draws together, and given enough time, it draws everything together. Gas into stars, stars into galaxies, galaxies into clusters, clusters into the cosmic web. The history of the universe is the history of gravitational community building, the progressive aggregation of matter into increasingly complex, increasingly structured, increasingly interdependent groupings that the gravitational force creates and sustains. The contemplative traditions have described this pattern with remarkable consistency across every major civilization. In Buddhism, the teaching of interdependence, that all phenomena arise in mutual dependence and that no phenomenon exists independently, is not limited to the subatomic level. It applies at every scale. Atoms depend on electrons, organisms depend on cells, ecosystems depend on species, and the cosmos depends on the laws of physics that constitute its ground. The Huayan Buddhist school's image of Indra's net, the infinite net in which every node contains a jewel that reflects every other jewel, is a description of the fractal interdependence that the physics reveals. At every scale, every part reflects and depends on every other part. In Christianity, Paul's image of the body of Christ provides the biological analogy. The eye cannot say to the hand, "I have no need of you," nor again the head to the feet, "I have no need of you." Every part needs every other part. The body is not a collection of independent organs. It is a community of mutual dependence, and the health of the body requires the health of every relationship within it. In Islam, the concept of the Ummah, the worldwide community of believers, encodes the same principle at the social level. The Prophet Muhammad described the Ummah as a single body. If one part of it feels pain, the whole body responds with sleeplessness and fever. The social body, like the biological body, is a community of mandatory mutual dependence, in which the suffering of any part is the suffering of the whole. The pattern is now clear. At every scale of physical reality, from quarks to atoms, from atoms to molecules, from molecules to cells, from cells to organisms, from organisms to ecosystems, from ecosystems to galaxies, from galaxies to the cosmic web, the same principle operates. The fundamental constituents of reality cannot exist in isolation. They are bound, connected, related, entangled, symbiotic, communal, and inseparable. The forms of the relationship change from scale to scale. The strong force binds quarks. Electromagnetism binds atoms. Chemistry binds molecules. Biology binds cells. Ecology binds species. Gravity binds galaxies. But the principle is one principle, and the message is one message. Being is relational. Isolation is prohibited. Connection is not optional. It is constitutive. In the next stage, we will turn this principle inward toward consciousness, toward the brain, and toward the experience of loneliness. Because if the universe forbids isolation at every level of physical reality, then the loneliness that conscious beings experience is not merely a psychological problem. It is a violation of a cosmic principle, a state that the physics of every scale, from quarks to galaxies, says should not exist. And the question of why we feel lonely in a universe that is constitutively relational, that prohibits isolation at every level, that is woven from connection at every scale, is a question that the physics, the neuroscience, and the contemplative traditions answer with one voice. We have now traced the prohibition against isolation from the quarks inside your protons, through the atoms, molecules, cells, organisms, ecosystems, and galaxies that constitute the physical world. At every scale, the same principle operates. The fundamental constituents of reality cannot exist alone. Quarks are confined by the strong force. Electrons are differentiated by the Pauli exclusion principle. Atoms are driven to bond by the energy landscape of quantum mechanics. Cells die when isolated from their neighbors. Organisms cannot survive without their microbiomes. Species cannot persist without their ecosystems. And galaxies are bound into the cosmic web by the gravitational force that has been drawing matter together since the first moment of the Big Bang. Now we must turn this principle inward toward consciousness, toward the brain, and toward the experience that is, paradoxically, one of the most common experiences in human life, despite being physically impossible at every other level of reality. That experience is loneliness. Loneliness is the feeling of being alone, the subjective experience of disconnection, of isolation, of being cut off from the web of relationships that every other level of reality insists is mandatory. And it is, by every measure available to science, one of the most destructive experiences that a human being can have. The neuroscientist John Cacioppo at the University of Chicago spent 3 decades studying the neuroscience and the physiology of loneliness, and his findings are devastating. Loneliness is not merely an unpleasant feeling. It is a physiological state that damages the body at every level, from the molecular to the systemic, from the genetic to the immunological, from the cardiovascular to the neurological. Loneliness is a slow-acting poison that the body recognizes at the deepest biological level as a threat to survival. Cacioppo's research documented that chronic loneliness increases cortisol levels, the stress hormone that, in elevated concentrations, suppresses the immune system, increases blood pressure, promotes inflammation, and accelerates the aging of every tissue in the body. Lonely individuals show higher levels of inflammatory markers, C-reactive protein, interleukin, 6, tumor necrosis, factor alpha, the same markers that are elevated in chronic diseases such as heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. The inflammation is not caused by an infection or an injury. It is caused by the state of being alone, by the brain's assessment that the organism is isolated from its social group and that the isolation constitutes a threat that requires the activation of the body's emergency response systems. The immune system responds to loneliness with a specific, documented, and reproducible pattern that Cacioppo and the genomics researcher Steve Cole at UCLA called the Conserved Transcriptional Response to Adversity, CTRA. In lonely individuals, the genes that produce antiviral immune responses are downregulated, while the genes that produce inflammatory responses are upregulated. The body is shifting its immune strategy from long-term defense against viruses to short-term defense against bacterial infection and wound healing. The immune profile of an organism that expects to be physically injured, because throughout evolutionary history, isolation from the group meant vulnerability to predators, to enemies, and to the physical dangers that the group's protection would normally prevent. Cole's work on the CTRA has revealed something even more specific. The gene expression changes caused by loneliness begin within days of social isolation and reverse within days of social reconnection. The genome is not passively recording the organism's social state. It is actively responding to it, continuously monitoring the social environment and adjusting the body's entire immunological and inflammatory profile in real time, based on the perceived quality and quantity of social connection. The genome is a social sensor. It reads the social environment with the same sensitivity and the same precision that it reads the chemical environment, the thermal environment, and the pathogenic environment. And it responds to social disconnection with the same urgency and the same biological seriousness that it responds to infection, injury, or toxic exposure. The implications are extraordinary. The genome does not merely benefit from social connection, it requires it. The genetic expression profile of the isolated organism is a stress profile, a profile that is designed for short-term survival in a dangerous environment, not for long-term health in a safe one. The genome is not designed to operate in isolation. It is designed to operate in community. And when it is forced to operate in isolation, it shifts to an emergency mode that sacrifices long-term health for short-term survival, a trade-off that, if sustained, accelerates aging, promotes disease, and ultimately kills the organism. The body's response to loneliness is not a modern phenomenon caused by smartphones and social media. It is an ancient, evolutionarily conserved biological program that equates isolation with danger and that activates the same emergency systems that the body activates in response to physical threat. The lonely body is a body on high alert, cortisol elevated, inflammation increased, immune function compromised, sleep disrupted, cardiovascular system strained. And the cumulative effect of this sustained emergency response is measurable. Chronic loneliness increases the risk of premature death by approximately 26%. This is comparable to the mortality risk of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Loneliness is as lethal as nicotine. The former Surgeon General of the United States, Vivek Murthy, declared loneliness a public health epidemic in 2023, citing data showing that approximately 1 in 2 American adults reports experiencing measurable loneliness. The epidemic is not confined to the elderly or the socially marginalized. It affects young adults at higher rates than any other age group. It affects people in marriages, in workplaces, in crowded cities. Loneliness is not the absence of people. It is the absence of connection, the subjective perception of disconnection that can occur even in the presence of others, when the quality of the relationships does not meet the brain's requirements for genuine social bonding. The paradox of modern loneliness is that it occurs in the most connected civilization in human history. We have social media platforms that connect billions of people. We have communication technologies that allow instant contact with anyone on Earth. We have cities of millions in which human beings are physically closer together than at any other time in the species' history. And yet the rates of loneliness have increased steadily for decades, reaching levels that public health officials now classify as epidemic. The paradox dissolves when you understand that loneliness is not the absence of contact, it is the absence of connection. And connection, as the physics of every scale has shown us, is not merely proximity. It is integration, the deep, sustained, mutually constitutive entanglement of two systems that produces something greater than the sum of the parts. 1,000 social media interactions that do not produce integrated information, that do not create interbrain synchrony, that do not generate shared emotional states, that do not result in the mutual alteration of each party's neural architecture are not connection. They are proximity without integration. They are atoms occupying adjacent positions in a lattice without forming chemical bonds. They are quarks that are near each other, but not bound by the gluon field that would make them a proton. Proximity is not connection. Contact is not integration. And the epidemic of loneliness is the epidemic of a civilization that has maximized contact while allowing integration to atrophy. The neuroscience of loneliness reveals why the brain treats isolation as a threat. The social brain hypothesis, developed by the anthropologist Robin Dunbar, proposes that the human brain evolved its extraordinary size and complexity primarily to manage social relationships. The neocortex, the outermost layer of the brain, responsible for language, reasoning, planning, and self-awareness, is disproportionately large in humans compared to other mammals, and its size correlates, across primate species, with the size of the social group that the species maintains. Humans have the largest neocortex and the largest social groups. The brain's most distinctive feature, its cortical expansion, its cognitive power, its capacity for consciousness, evolved for the purpose of relationship. Matthew Lieberman at UCLA has extended Dunbar's thesis with his discovery that the brain's default mode network, the network that activates when the brain is not engaged in any specific task, when it is at rest, is a social processing network. When you are doing nothing, when you are staring out a window, daydreaming, waiting for a bus, your brain is thinking about other people. It is simulating social interactions, predicting other people's behavior, processing social memories, and rehearsing future social encounters. The brain's default state is social. When the brain has nothing else to do, it does social processing. This is the brain's resting state, its ground state, its vacuum state, its lowest energy configuration, and this ground state is social. The parallel to the QCD vacuum is striking. The QCD vacuum, the ground state of the strong force field, is not empty. It is filled with virtual quark-antiquark pairs and virtual gluons, constantly creating and annihilating, constantly generating the relational activity that constitutes the vacuum's energy. The brain's default mode, the ground state of neural activity, is not empty. It is filled with social processing, constantly simulating relationships, constantly generating the relational activity that constitutes the brain's resting energy consumption. The brain at rest is the brain in relationship not with actual people in the room, but with the mental representations of people that the social processing networks maintain. Even when you are alone, your brain is not alone. It is processing relationships, simulating connections, maintaining the social web that its evolutionary architecture was designed to sustain. This means that the brain is not a general-purpose computer that happens to process social information among many other types. It is a social computer that has been optimized over millions of years of evolution for the processing of social relationships. The circuits that process faces, voices, emotions, intentions, and social hierarchies are among the most developed and most metabolically expensive circuits in the brain. The brain invests more energy in social processing than in any other cognitive function. And when the social input is absent, when the brain is deprived of the relational data that it was built to process, it does not merely become bored, it becomes impaired. Cacioppo documented that loneliness impairs executive function, the prefrontal cortex's capacity for planning, decision-making, and self-regulation. It impairs sleep architecture. Lonely individuals show more micro-awakenings, less slow-wave sleep, and less restorative sleep than connected individuals. It impairs memory formation and retrieval, and it accelerates cognitive decline in aging, increasing the risk of Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. The brain that is deprived of social connection does not merely function less well. It deteriorates structurally, functionally, and progressively in a pattern that mirrors the deterioration caused by chronic disease. The social neuroscientist Naomi Eisenberger at UCLA provided the most striking finding. Social pain and physical pain share the same neural circuitry. The dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, the regions that process the distress component of physical pain, are activated by social exclusion with the same intensity and the same neural signature as a physical injury. The brain does not distinguish between a broken bone and a broken relationship. Both activate the same alarm system. Both produce the same distress signal. Both mobilize the same emergency responses. The body treats social disconnection as a physical wound because, at the deepest biological level, it is. Eisenberger's finding has been replicated across multiple laboratories and extended by further research showing that acetaminophen Tylenol reduces social pain just as effectively as it reduces physical pain. This is not a metaphorical finding. It is a pharmacological fact. The same molecule that reduces the distress of a headache reduces the distress of social rejection because the neural circuits that process both types of pain are the same circuits and respond to the same chemical interventions. The body does not have separate systems for physical and social pain. It has a single pain system that processes both because, from the body's perspective, both are the same type of threat, a disruption of the structural integrity that the organism requires for survival. The psychologist Kipling Williams has documented the speed and the automaticity of the brain's response to social exclusion. In his cyberball experiments, participants play a simple ball-tossing game on a computer with two other players who are actually controlled by the software. When the software begins to exclude the participant throwing the ball only between the two other players, the participant shows measurable distress within 2 minutes. The dorsal anterior cingulate cortex activates, self-reported mood drops, and the distress occurs even when the participant knows the other players are computer programs, even when the participant has been told in advance that the exclusion is random, and even when the stakes are zero. The brain's response to exclusion is automatic, pre-rational, and independent of context. It fires whenever exclusion is detected, regardless of the circumstances, because the prohibition against isolation is wired into the deepest, oldest, most non-negotiable circuits of the brain. This is where the connection to quark confinement becomes precise rather than metaphorical. The quark's confinement is enforced by the strong force. The attempt to isolate a quark generates the energy that creates new companions, preventing the isolation from being achieved. The human being's confinement in relationship is enforced by the brain's social circuitry. The experience of isolation generates the stress response that damages the body, creating a biological pressure to restore connection that is as relentless and as self-enforcing as the strong force's prohibition against free quarks. The parallel extends further. The quark that is close to other quarks experiences asymptotic freedom, the reduction of the strong force that occurs at short distances, producing a state of relative ease and liberty within the proton. The human being who is in close, healthy relationships experiences the neurochemical equivalent of asymptotic freedom, reduced cortisol, elevated oxytocin, enhanced immune function, improved sleep, better cognitive performance, and longer life. The biology of connection is the biology of freedom, the biological state of ease, health, and flourishing that the organism achieves when the mandatory requirement for relationship is met. And the quark that tries to separate experiences the increasing force that prevents isolation, the flux tube that stretches, strengthens, and eventually snaps to create new companions. The human being who becomes isolated experiences the increasing force of the loneliness response, the cortisol elevation, the inflammation, the immune suppression, the cognitive impairment, the accelerated aging that the biology imposes to compel the restoration of connection. The force increases with the degree of isolation, just as the strong force increases with the distance between quarks. And the ultimate consequence of unresolved isolation, premature death, is the human equivalent of the flux tube snapping, the biological system's terminal response to a state that the physics of every level of reality says should not exist. Integrated information theory provides the theoretical framework for understanding why consciousness cannot be isolated. In IIT, consciousness is identical to integrated information phi, which measures how much a system is more than the sum of its parts. Phi requires integration, the interaction, the correlation, the mutual information between the parts of the system. An isolated system, a system with no interactions, no correlations, no mutual information with any other system, has zero phi. It has no integrated information. And if consciousness is identical to integrated information, then an isolated system has no consciousness. This is a remarkable conclusion. It means that consciousness is, by its very nature, relational. Consciousness does not exist in isolation any more than quarks exist in isolation. Consciousness is constituted by relationship, by the integration of information between the parts of the system, by the mutual influence of neurons on each other, by the correlation of brain states with environmental states, by the interbrain synchrony that connects one consciousness to another. Remove the relationships, and the phi drops to zero. Remove the connections, and consciousness disappears not because the substrate has been destroyed, but because consciousness is relationship. Consciousness is integration. Consciousness is the phi that arises when separate systems become more than the sum of their parts. And isolation, by definition, prevents this from happening. The implication for the loneliness epidemic is direct. Loneliness is not merely the deprivation of social contact. It is the deprivation of integrated information, the deprivation of the phi that consciousness requires to exist in its fullest form. The lonely person's consciousness is not merely unhappy. It is diminished, reduced in its integration, its complexity, and its richness by the absence of the relational input that generates phi. The lonely brain is a brain with reduced integrated information, just as the isolated atom is an atom with unfilled electron shells, still functional, still existing, but operating below its potential, missing the connections that would complete it. The neuroscience confirms this. Lonely individuals show reduced functional connectivity between brain regions, less integration between the networks that process emotion, memory, perception, and executive function. The lonely brain is not merely a sad brain. It is a disconnected brain, a brain whose internal integration mirrors the external isolation, whose phi is reduced not because the neurons are damaged, but because the relational input that drives integration is absent. The external loneliness produces internal fragmentation. The loss of outer connection produces a loss of inner coherence. And the experience of loneliness, the specific, qualitative, subjective experience of being cut off from the world, may be the phenomenological expression of reduced phi, the experience of what it feels like when consciousness loses the integration that constitutes it. The contemplative traditions have described this with extraordinary precision. In Buddhism, the concept of anatta, no self, is the direct philosophical expression of the principle that consciousness has no independent, isolated existence. The self that you experience as you, the persistent, unified, independently existing subject that seems to be the center of your experience, does not exist as an independent entity. It is a pattern of relationships between the five aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Remove the relationships between the aggregates, and the self disappears. The self is not a thing that has relationships. The self is the relationships. It is constituted by them, sustained by them, and dissolved when they dissolve. The Buddhist teaching that suffering arises from the illusion of a separate self is, in the IIT framework, a statement about the relationship between isolation and the loss of integrated information. The illusion of a separate self is the illusion that consciousness can exist independently, that the I is a self-contained entity that does not need the relationships that constitute it. This illusion generates suffering because it produces the experience of isolation, the experience of being a separate, bounded, independently existing entity in a universe that, at every level, prohibits independent existence. The suffering of isolation is not caused by the absence of other people. It is caused by the delusion that you are separate from them, the delusion that the boundary between self and other is real, when the physics of every scale, from quarks to galaxies, says that no such boundary exists. In Christianity, the concept of sin, in its deepest theological meaning, not its moralistic popular usage, is the state of separation from God, from other human beings, and from the created order. Sin is not merely the violation of a rule. It is the condition of isolation, the state in which the soul has turned away from the relationships that constitute its being, and has attempted to exist independently, self-sufficiently, without the connections that the divine order requires. The consequence of sin is death, not as punishment but as natural consequence, the way that a cell that detaches from its neighbours undergoes Anoikis. The isolated soul dies because isolation is not a viable state for a being that is constituted by relationship. Augustine describes sin as incurvatus in se, the soul curved in upon itself, turned away from God and from other beings, folded into a state of self-referential isolation that cuts it off from the source of its life. The image is geometrical, and in the framework of emergent space-time, it is physically precise. The soul curved in upon itself is a consciousness whose entanglement with the external world has been reduced to zero, a consciousness that has decoherent from the web of relationships that constitute its being, that has retreated into a state of isolated self-reference that the physics of every level of reality says is impossible to sustain. The cure for sin, in the Christian framework, is grace, the divine energy that reaches into the isolated soul and reconnects it to the web of relationships from which it has withdrawn. Grace is not a reward for good behavior. It is the restoration of connection, the divine equivalent of the gluon flux tube that snaps to create new companions when a quark tries to be alone. The isolated soul cannot save itself because isolation has reduced its phi to zero, and it has no capacity for the integrated processing that self-rescue would require. The rescue must come from outside, from the divine love that reaches into the isolation and draws the soul back into relationship, restoring the connections that constitute its being. The Christian practice of liturgical worship is, in this framework, a technology for restoring phi. The gathering of the community in shared prayer, shared song, shared attention, and shared participation in the sacraments is not merely a social activity. It is a phi-generating activity, a practice that increases the integrated information of the collective by synchronizing the neural states of the participants, generating interbrain coherence, and producing a collective consciousness whose phi exceeds the sum of the individual phys. The liturgy is the antidote to incurvatus in se, the practice that curves the soul outward, toward God and toward other persons, restoring the relational orientation that sin disrupted. And the experience of the liturgy, the feeling of being uplifted, connected, part of something larger than yourself, is the subjective experience of increasing phi, the felt sense of integrated information being restored. In Islam, the concept of jahaliya, the state of ignorance that prevailed before the revelation of Islam, is described as a state of disconnection. Disconnection from God, from the community of believers, and from the moral order that connects human beings to each other and to their Creator. The cure for jahaliya is iman, faith, which is not merely intellectual assent to a set of propositions but the active, practice-sustained, community-embedded reconnection to the web of relationships that constitutes the Islamic way of life. The 5 pillars of Islam are all practices of connection. The Shahada connects the believer to God, Salat connects the believer to the community through regular communal prayer, Zakat connects the believer to the poor through mandatory charity. Psalm connects the believer to the discipline of shared fasting, and Hajj connects the believer to the worldwide Ummah through the physical gathering at Mecca. In Hinduism, the concept of Maya, the illusion that obscures the true nature of reality, is precisely the illusion that the separate self exists independently. Maya is not the illusion that the world is unreal. It is the illusion that the world is made of separate, independently existing things, that you are separate from me, that I am separate from the tree, that the tree is separate from the earth, that the earth is separate from the cosmos. The Advaita Vedanta tradition teaches that the realization of non-duality, the direct perception that separation is an illusion and that all things are Brahman, is the cure for the suffering that Maya produces. The cure is not the creation of new connections. It is the recognition that the connections were always there, that the separation was never real, that the isolation was always an illusion, and that the true nature of every being is relationship, integration, and the inseparable unity that the physics of every scale confirms. The Advaita master Shankara described the recognition of non-duality in terms that directly parallel the physics of quark confinement. Brahman alone is real. The world is appearance. The self is Brahman. The separate self is not real in the way that it appears to be. It is an appearance, a surface phenomenon generated by the decoherence of ordinary consciousness, just as the apparent separateness of the proton is a surface phenomenon generated by the color-neutral exterior that conceals the seething, inseparable, relational interior. The proton appears to be a simple, self-contained entity, but it is constituted by quarks and gluons in inseparable relationship. The self appears to be a simple, self-contained entity, but it is constituted by the relationships neurological, biological, social, and cosmic that connect it to everything else. The appearance of independence is the Maya. The reality of inseparable connection is the Brahman, and the recognition of this reality is the cure for the suffering that the illusion of isolation produces. In the next and final stage, we will bring everything together: the quarks, the atoms, the cells, the brains, the galaxies, and the contemplative traditions. We will ask what the universe's prohibition against isolation means for the person who feels lonely, for the civilization that is experiencing an epidemic of disconnection, and for the conscious beings who inhabit a cosmos that was built from the ground up, from the inseparable fabric of connection. Because the loneliness you sometimes feel is not merely a psychological problem to be solved with better social skills or more social media. It is a cosmic misalignment, a state in which your experience contradicts the fundamental structure of the reality you inhabit. And the resolution of this misalignment may require not merely more human contact, but a deeper perception of the connection that was always there, the connection that the quarks know, that the atoms know, that the cells know, and that only the decoherence of ordinary consciousness has ever concealed from you. We have now traced a single principle through every layer of physical reality. At the subatomic level, quarks are confined by the strong force the universe converts the energy of every attempted separation into the creation of new companions, making isolation physically impossible. At the atomic level, the Pauli exclusion principle forces particles into mandatory differentiation that creates the structured, chemically active atoms from which all matter is built. At the molecular level, atoms are driven to bond by the energy landscape of quantum mechanics, sharing and exchanging electrons in relationships that produce new entities with properties that no individual atom possesses. At the cellular level, organisms die when isolated from their neighbors, and the eukaryotic cell itself is an ancient, irreversible partnership between formerly independent organisms. At the biological level, every organism is a Holo-biont, a community of species in mandatory symbiosis. At the ecological level, no species can survive alone. And at the cosmic level, the gravitational force binds every galaxy into the cosmic web, preventing the dispersal of matter into the void. At the level of consciousness, the same principle operates with devastating clarity. Loneliness kills. The genome reads social isolation as a mortal threat. The brain processes social exclusion through the same circuits that process physical injury. And integrated information theory demonstrates that consciousness itself is constituted by relationship, that isolated consciousness is a contradiction in terms, that phi requires integration, and that the removal of connection is the removal of the very thing that makes consciousness conscious. Now we must bring all of this together and ask what it means. Not merely what it means for physics, or for neuroscience, or for theology. What it means for you, for the person reading these words, for the conscious being who has, at some point in their life, felt the specific, unmistakable, physiologically devastating experience of being alone in a universe that, at every level of its structure, insists that aloneness is impossible. Let us begin with the most fundamental question. Why does the universe prohibit isolation? The answer, assembled from every investigation in this series, is that isolation is ontologically incoherent. It is not merely impractical or disadvantageous. It is impossible in the same way that a square circle is impossible, in the same way that a married bachelor is impossible. Isolation requires the existence of an entity that has no relationships. But every entity in the universe is constituted by its relationships. A quark is defined by its color charge, which is a relational property. An electron is defined by its quantum state, which is determined by its relationships with other electrons. An atom is defined by its electron configuration, which is determined by the Pauli exclusion principle's relational mandate. A cell is defined by its gene expression profile, which is determined by the signals it receives from its environment. A person is defined by their neural architecture, which is shaped by the relationships they have had. At every level, the entity is its relationships. Remove the relationships, and you remove the entity. Isolation is not the entity existing without relationships. It is the entity ceasing to exist. The philosopher Martin Heidegger described the human being as Dasein, being there, being in the world. The human being is not a subject that exists independently and then enters into relationships with the world. The human being is constitutively in the world, defined by its relationships with things, with other people, and with the world as a whole. Remove the relationships, and you do not have a lonely Dasein. You have no Dasein at all. Heidegger arrived at this conclusion through phenomenological analysis. The physics arrives at the same conclusion through quantum chromodynamics. The methods are different. The conclusion is identical. Being is relational, and the concept of an independently existing entity is incoherent. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas went further, arguing that the encounter with the other, with another conscious being, with another face, is not merely one experience among many. It is the foundational experience from which all other experiences derive. The self does not exist first and then encounter the other. The self is constituted by the encounter with the other. Before the encounter, there is no self. Only the undifferentiated potential from which the encounter will produce both the self and the other simultaneously. The way the strong force produces quarks and gluons simultaneously from the undifferentiated energy of the vacuum. Levinas's insight maps precisely onto the physics of quark confinement. You cannot have a quark without a gluon field, and you cannot have a gluon field without quarks. They are co-arising, mutually constitutive, simultaneously produced, inseparable from the moment of their emergence. Similarly, you cannot have a self without an other, and you cannot have an other without a self. They are co-arising, mutually constitutive, simultaneously produced by the encounter that Levinas describes as the foundational event of consciousness. This is the deepest lesson of quark confinement. You cannot isolate a quark, because a quark without the gluon field is not a quark. You cannot isolate an atom, because an atom without its electron relationships is not an atom. You cannot isolate a cell, because a cell without its environment is not a cell. And you cannot isolate a consciousness, because a consciousness without its relationships is not a consciousness. The isolation does not produce a lonely entity. It produces no entity at all. The loneliness you feel then is not the experience of being alone. It is the experience of a contradiction, the experience of a consciousness that believes it is isolated, while being, at every level of its physical structure, constitutively connected to everything in the universe. The quarks in your protons are bound by the gluon field. The atoms in your molecules are bound by chemical bonds. The cells in your body are bound by signaling networks. The neurons in your brain are bound by synaptic connections. The bacteria in your gut are bound by the symbiotic partnership of the Holo-biont. And the quantum state of your body is entangled through the correlations that every interaction creates, with the quantum states of every person you have ever met, every object you have ever touched, and every photon that has ever bounced off your skin. You are connected, at every level, through every mechanism, by every force, with everything. The connection is not optional. It is not something you have to create. It is something you are. You are the connection. You are the relationship. You are the binding energy that constitutes 99% of your mass. You are the gluon field made conscious. Consider what this means concretely. Right now, as you read these words, the quarks in your body are bound by gluon fields whose energy constitutes 99% of your mass. The electrons in your atoms are entangled with each other through the Pauli exclusion principle, creating the chemical structure that makes your biology possible. The cells in your body are exchanging signals with their neighbors through thousands of receptor proteins, maintaining the community that the Anoikis mechanism will destroy if it is disrupted. The bacteria in your gut are communicating with your brain through the vagus nerve, shaping your mood, your cognition, and your immune function. And the quantum state of your body is correlated through the entanglement that every interaction creates with the quantum states of every person you have loved, every place you have visited, and every breath of air that has ever passed through your lungs. You are the most connected entity you can imagine. Your body is a community of 30 trillion human cells and 38 trillion bacterial cells, sharing resources, exchanging signals, and cooperating in a symbiosis so deep that neither partner can survive without the other. Your brain is a network of 86 billion neurons connected by 100 trillion synapses, generating the integrated information that constitutes your conscious experience. And your quantum state is entangled with the quantum state of the entire universe through the correlations that 14 billion years of cosmic history have created. The feeling of isolation in this context is not merely incorrect, it is cosmically absurd. It is like a wave feeling isolated from the ocean. It is like a flame feeling isolated from the fire. It is like a note feeling isolated from the symphony. The wave is the ocean, the flame is the fire, the note is the symphony, and you are the universe experiencing itself from a specific, unique, irreplaceable perspective that only you can provide. The loneliness is real as an experience, but it is not real as a description of your actual situation in the universe. It is a perceptual error, a failure of consciousness to perceive the connections that constitute it. And this perceptual error has a specific physical cause: decoherence. We have encountered decoherence throughout this series. In our investigation of distance, decoherence was the mechanism that creates the illusion of spatial separation from the underlying reality of entanglement. In our investigation of grief, decoherence was the barrier that death imposes between the living and the dead. In our investigation of the dark universe, decoherence was the process that differentiates the unified vacuum into the multiplicity of apparently separate objects. And here, in the context of loneliness, Decoherence is the mechanism that creates the illusion of isolation in a universe that prohibits isolation at every level. Decoherence is the process by which a quantum system loses its coherence, its entanglement, its integration, its connection through interaction with its environment. The system's quantum correlations are redistributed into the environment, becoming so diluted and so complex that they are effectively invisible. The system appears to be classical, separate, bounded, independent, but the correlations have not been destroyed. They have been hidden. The connection is still there. It is merely imperceptible to the consciousness that is looking for it, with the wrong instruments, with the senses, with a conceptual mind, with the ego's framework of self and other that decoherence has installed as the default mode of perception. Loneliness is the subjective experience of decoherence. It is the experience of a consciousness whose quantum correlations with the surrounding reality have been hidden by the thermal noise of the macroscopic environment, hidden so effectively that the consciousness can no longer perceive them and believes, mistakenly, that it is alone. The loneliness is not caused by the absence of connection. It is caused by the invisibility of connection, by the decoherence barrier that prevents the conscious mind from perceiving the web of quantum correlations that constitutes its relationship with everything in the universe. The decoherence that produces loneliness operates at multiple levels. At the physical level, the thermal noise of the macroscopic environment scrambles the quantum correlations between your body and the bodies of other people, making the entanglement imperceptible to ordinary measurement. At the neural level, the default mode network's self-referential processing generates a stream of self-focused thoughts. I am here. They are there. I am separate. I am alone. That creates a cognitive model of isolation that the brain mistakes for a perception of reality. At the social level, the cultural frameworks of individualism, autonomy, and independence reinforce the illusion of separateness by treating the self as a bounded, self-contained unit whose relationships are optional additions rather than constitutive requirements. Each level of decoherence reinforces the others. The physical decoherence makes the quantum connections imperceptible. The neural decoherence generates the cognitive model of isolation. The cultural decoherence validates the model and presents it as normal, healthy, and desirable. And the result is the epidemic of loneliness, a civilization of physically connected, neurally isolated, culturally validated, cosmically impossible, lonely people. The contemplative traditions address loneliness at all three levels simultaneously. They provide practices that reduce physical decoherence: meditation, prayer, communal worship. They provide cognitive frameworks that challenge the model of isolation, dependent origination, the body of Christ, Tawhid, Advaita, and they provide communities that embody the connection they describe: Sangha, Koinonia, Ummah, Satsang. The triple intervention, physical, cognitive, and social, is what makes the contemplative traditions so effective at addressing the deepest forms of loneliness, forms that mere social contact cannot reach. This reframing changes everything about how we understand loneliness. In the conventional framework, loneliness is caused by the absence of social contact, and the cure is more social contact. In the quantum framework, loneliness is caused by the imperceptibility of existing connection, and the cure is the enhanced perception of connection that was always there. The first framework says, you are alone, and you need to find people to connect with. The second framework says, you are already connected, and you need to learn to perceive the connections that decoherence is concealing. Both frameworks have value. Social contact is genuinely important, and the absence of human relationship is genuinely damaging. The Cacioppo research is not wrong. Loneliness kills, and human connection is the antidote. But the quantum framework adds a dimension that the conventional framework lacks: the recognition that the connection you seek is not something you must create from scratch. It is something that already exists, and that requires a specific kind of perception to detect. The contemplative traditions have been developing this perception for millennia. In Buddhism, the practice of metta-loving-kindness meditation is a systematic training in the perception of connection. The practitioner begins by generating feelings of warmth and goodwill toward themselves, then extends these feelings outward in concentric circles, to a loved one, to a neutral person, to a difficult person, and finally to all sentient beings without exception. The practice is not the creation of connection. It is the recognition of connection, the progressive dissolution of the decoherence-maintained boundaries between self and other, until the practitioner perceives, directly and non-conceptually, the interconnection that was always present. The neuroscience of metta-meditation confirms its effectiveness. Richard Davidson and Antoine Lutz at the University of Wisconsin-Madison have documented that long-term metta-practitioners show enhanced gamma coherence, increased insular activation, greater interbrain synchrony with others, and structural changes in brain regions associated with empathy and social cognition. The practice produces measurable changes in the brain's capacity for social connection, changes that persist between meditation sessions and that deepen over years of practice. The practitioner is not merely imagining connection. They are training the neural circuits that perceive connection, enhancing the brain's sensitivity to the quantum correlations that decoherence normally conceals. The Dalai Lama has described the metta-practitioner's experience in terms that directly parallel the physics of decoherence reduction. When you develop a sense of caring for others, it brings a kind of inner strength. This inner strength helps to eliminate fear and suspicion. It gives you a sense of belonging, a sense of being at home in the universe. The sense of being at home in the universe is the experience of reduced decoherence, the experience of perceiving, however partially, the web of connections that constitute your relationship with everything in the cosmos. The practice produces this perception not by creating connections that did not exist, but by removing the barriers that prevented the connections from being perceived. The Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh taught the practice of interbeing, the direct perception that you are not a separate self, but a nexus of relationships, that you inter-are with the cloud, the rain, the soil, the sun, and every being that has contributed to the conditions of your existence. The practice is simple. Look deeply at anything, a piece of bread, a flower, a person, and see, in that one thing, all the causes and conditions that produced it. See the farmer in the bread, see the sun in the flower, see the entire cosmos in the face of the person before you. This is not metaphor. It is the direct perception of dependent origination, the direct perception of the web of connections that constitutes every apparently separate entity. And the perception, when it arises, dissolves the loneliness, because the loneliness was caused by the failure to see what the practice reveals. That separation was never real. In Christianity, the practice of contemplative prayer serves the same function. The Hesychast tradition's Jesus prayer, repeated thousands of times with each breath, progressively stills the internal noise of the conceptual mind and opens the practitioner to the perception of the divine presence that pervades all things. The divine presence is not distant. It is not separate. It is, as Paul declared, the ground in which we live and move and have our being. The contemplative perceives this ground directly, perceives the connection to God, to other persons, and to the created order that the noise of the decoherent mind normally obscures. The prayer does not create the connection. It reveals the connection by reducing the decoherence that conceals it. The Christian community, the koinonia, the fellowship, the body of Christ, is the social structure that supports this perception. The community gathers not merely for social contact, but for shared perception, for the collective practice of worship, prayer, and sacramental participation that generates the interbrain coherence and the collective phi that make the underlying connection perceptible. The liturgy is a decoherence reduction technology. The Eucharist is a connection revelation practice, and the community is the environment in which the individual's perception of connection is supported, amplified, and sustained. In Islam, the practice of dhikr, the continuous remembrance of God through the repetition of divine names, is the Sufi method for perceiving the connection that the decoherent mind conceals. Each repetition of the divine name is a pulse of coherence that counters the decoherence of ordinary consciousness. The cumulative effect is the progressive thinning of the veil between the individual consciousness and the divine ground, the progressive perception of the Tawhid, the divine unity that connects everything to everything through the single divine reality from which all things emerge. The 5 daily prayers of Islam Salat are a rhythm of reconnection that punctuates the day at regular intervals, preventing the decoherence of ordinary consciousness from accumulating unchecked. Each prayer is a pause, a recalibration, a moment in which the believer turns away from the scattered, distracted, decoherent state of ordinary activity and toward the focused, concentrated, coherent state of prayer. The prayers are not merely obligations. They are maintenance procedures, regular interventions that keep the connection to the divine ground perceptible and that prevent the loneliness that accumulates when the connection is forgotten. Rumi described the cure for loneliness with an image that condenses the entire investigation into a single verse. Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it. The barriers are the decoherence, the physical, neural, and cultural layers of noise that conceal the connection that was always present. The task is not to create connection. It is to remove the barriers that prevent the perception of connection. And the removal of barriers is exactly what every contemplative practice, in every tradition, is designed to achieve. The Sufi concept of the polished heart, the heart that has been cleansed of the rust of worldly attachment and the tarnish of ego identification, is the precise image of a consciousness whose decoherence has been reduced to the point where it can reflect the divine light without distortion. The unpolished heart perceives isolation because the tarnish distorts the reflection. The polished heart perceives connection because the reflection is clear. The light was always there. The task was always the polishing, never the creation of light. In Hinduism, the practice of yoga, which means, literally, union, is the systematic practice of reconnection. The 8 limbs of Patanjali's yoga are a comprehensive program for reducing the decoherence that creates the illusion of separation. The yamas and niyamas regulate behavior, reducing the social decoherence that conflict and dishonesty produce. Asana regulates the body, reducing the physical tension that generates neural noise. Pranayama regulates the breath, which regulates the autonomic nervous system and reduces the physiological stress response. Pratyahara withdraws the senses from external stimulation, reducing the environmental decoherence that sensory input produces. Dharana concentrates attention on a single point, reducing the attentional scatter that fragments consciousness. Dhyana deepens this concentration into meditation. And Samadhi, the culmination, is the direct perception of union, the perception that the self and the world are not separate, that the Atman and the Brahman are one, that the isolation was always an illusion, and the connection was always the reality. The culmination of the yogic path, Samadhi, is described in the Yoga Sutras not as the achievement of something new, but as the recognition of something that was always the case. The sutra says, "Then the seer abides in its own nature." The seer's own nature is not isolation. It is connection, the direct, unmediated, non-conceptual perception of the unity that the decoherent mind normally obscures. Samadhi is not a trance state. It is the most lucid, most awake, most integrated state of consciousness available to a human being, the state in which phi is maximized, in which the boundaries between self and world are perceived as transparent, and in which the practitioner sees, with absolute clarity, that the isolation they had experienced was never real, and that the connection they were seeking was never absent. In Judaism, the Sabbath Shabbat is the weekly practice of reconnection. For 25 hours, the practitioner withdraws from the scattered, productive, goal-directed, decoherent activity of the work week and enters a state of rest, community, prayer, and shared meals that the tradition describes as a foretaste of the world to come. The Sabbath is not merely a day of rest, it is a day of connection to God through prayer and Torah study, connection to family through shared meals, connection to community through synagogue worship, and connection to the deeper rhythm of creation through the cessation of creative labor that mirrors God's rest on the seventh day. The Hasidic tradition's emphasis on simcha, joy, as a spiritual practice is directly relevant to the loneliness epidemic. The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, taught that joy is the primary spiritual quality and that sadness, including the sadness of loneliness, is the primary spiritual obstacle. Joy is not a luxury. It is a spiritual necessity because joy is the experiential signature of connection. You experience joy when the decoherence barrier thins and the underlying connection becomes perceptible. You experience sadness when the decoherence barrier thickens and the connection becomes invisible. The Baal Shem Tov's prescription: cultivate joy through prayer, through song, through dance, through community, through the recognition of the divine in every moment and every encounter, is a prescription for reducing decoherence and revealing the connection that loneliness conceals. The practical implications for the loneliness epidemic are immediate and specific. The crisis of loneliness in modern civilization is not merely a social problem that requires social solutions. It is a perceptual problem that requires perceptual solutions. The loneliness epidemic will not be cured by more social media platforms, more networking events, or more superficial social contact. It will be addressed by practices that reduce decoherence at every level, practices that enhance the brain's capacity for genuine connection, that challenge the cultural ideology of radical individualism, and that provide the communities in which deep, sustained, phi-generating relationships can form and flourish. The contemplative traditions are not relics of pre-scientific culture. They are technologies of connection that address the deepest cause of the loneliness epidemic, the decoherence-induced failure to perceive the connections that constitute our being. The physicist and the monk, the neuroscientist and the priest, the evolutionary biologist and the Sufi master are all describing the same reality from different perspectives, and the convergence of their descriptions is not a coincidence. It is evidence that the reality they are describing is real, that connection is the fundamental structure of the universe, that isolation is the fundamental illusion, and that the cure for the illusion is the perception of the reality that the illusion conceals. Every investigation in this series has converged on the same conclusion, approached from a different direction. Time is not what it appears to be, it is a block in which every moment of connection is permanently preserved. Distance is not what it appears to be, it is an emergent quantity that measures entanglement deficit, and the deepest reality is connection. Gravity is not what it appears to be, it is the geometric expression of the universe's tendency toward maximum entanglement. Death is not what it appears to be, it is the redistribution of information, not the destruction of connection. The dark universe is not what it appears to be, it is the informational ground from which the visible world is projected. Evolution is not what it appears to be, it is a quantum algorithm computing toward maximum consciousness. And loneliness is not what it appears to be, it is the decoherence-induced misperception of isolation in a universe that is constituted by connection. The quark knows this. The quark has never been alone. It cannot be alone. The strong force will not allow it. And the strong force is not the only force that prohibits isolation. Every force, at every scale, from the strong nuclear force to gravity, from the Pauli exclusion principle to the electrochemical signaling of the nervous system, from the symbiotic partnership of the Holo-biont to the gravitational binding of the cosmic web, enforces the same prohibition. Connection is mandatory. Isolation is forbidden. Being is relational. And you are not exempt from this prohibition. You cannot be exempt because the prohibition is not a rule imposed from outside. It is the structure of reality itself. You are made of quarks that cannot be alone. You are made of atoms whose identities are constituted by their relationships with other atoms. You are made of cells that die when isolated. You are made of organs that function only in community. You carry within your body 38 trillion bacterial partners without whom you cannot survive. And your consciousness is constituted by integrated information that requires relationship for its very existence. The loneliness you feel is real as an experience, but it is a perceptual error of cosmic proportions. You are feeling isolated in a universe that makes isolation impossible. You are feeling alone in a body that is a community. You are feeling disconnected in a consciousness that is constituted by connection. The feeling is real. The situation it describes is not. The cure for loneliness is not merely more social contact, although social contact is genuinely important. The cure for loneliness is the perception of the connection that is already there, the perception that every contemplative tradition has been training its practitioners to achieve for millennia, the perception that the physics of every scale confirms, the perception that the quarks in your body have always known. You are not alone. You have never been alone. You cannot be alone. The universe does not permit it. And the force that prevents your isolation, the force that holds the quarks together, the force that binds the atoms, the force that sustains the cells, the force that connects the galaxies, the force that draws conscious beings toward each other with an attraction that nothing in the universe can break, is the same force that you feel right now as the ache of loneliness. The ache is not the evidence that you are alone. It is the evidence that you are connected so deeply, so constitutively, so inescapably, that the mere illusion of disconnection causes your body to mount an emergency response, your genome to shift its expression profile, your brain to activate its pain circuits, and your consciousness to cry out for the reunion that the decoherence of ordinary perception has temporarily obscured. The ache of loneliness is the strong force of consciousness, the gluon field of the heart, pulling you back toward the connection that you never truly left. Listen to it. It is telling you the truth. You belong here. You belong to everything, and everything belongs to you. The quarks have always known this. The atoms have always known this. The cells have always known this. The galaxies have always known this. Every level of physical reality, from the smallest to the largest, from the simplest to the most complex, has always embodied the principle that this investigation has traced through quarks, atoms, cells, brains, ecosystems, and the cosmos. Connection is the substance of reality. Isolation is the one thing that reality will not permit, and now you know it too. Not because someone told you, not because you read it in a book, but because the evidence from every direction, from the physics of the strong force, from the chemistry of the chemical bond, from the biology of the cell, from the neuroscience of the social brain, from the cosmology of the cosmic web, and from the contemplative wisdom of every major civilization, converges on a single, inescapable, experimentally confirmed, phenomenologically verified, cosmologically demonstrated truth. You were never alone. You could never be alone. And the universe itself, From the gluon field in your protons to the gravitational web that connects the galaxies is the proof.